Please consider supporting us by clicking on the like and subscribe buttons. Your support will be greatly appreciated.
Slavery in colonial North America. Although histories of slavery in North America have usually begun with the famous sale in 1619 of 20 niggers by a Dutch ship captain to some English settlers in Jamestown, Virginia, we now know that some blacks had arrived in Jamestown even earlier, and that African slaves had appeared in Spanish Florida as early as the 1560s. Even more telling, by the mid-1600s, when the Sugar Revolution was beginning to transform the important English colony of Barbados, the Dutch in New Netherland, which was to become England's New York in 1664, were far more dependent on black slave labor than were the English in Virginia and Maryland. Racial slavery became embedded in the Americas in diverse and unpredictable ways. Because human life is so extraordinarily complex, any overview of American slavery must move beyond official restrictive laws and leave some room for slaves who rented out their labor, slaves who employed white workers as they transported cargoes on Mississippi riverboats, and even slave doctors and midwives who treated upper-class white patients. Thanks to the enormous scholarly research of the past 2 or 3 decades, one can find exceptions to virtually any generalization made about slave occupations, treatment, families, resistance, population growth, and many other matters. Nevertheless, slavery was always slavery in the sense of defining and selling human beings as saleable property. Privileges of any sort could and often did disappear as fast as a flash of lightning. Much of the diversity and complexity stems from the all-important paradox that, as the historian Philip D. Morgan has eloquently put it, slaves actively participated in their destiny and were victims of a brutal, dehumanizing system. Subject to grinding daily exploitation, caught in the grip of powerful forces that were often beyond their power to control, slaves nevertheless strove to create order in their lives, to preserve their humanity, to achieve dignity, and to sustain dreams of a better future. Since almost 2/3 of the history of North American slavery occurred before the American Revolution, not even counting Spanish Florida, it is highly misleading to think of all slavery in America in terms of cotton plantations in Mississippi in the 1850s. In this chapter, we will examine in some detail the evolution of slavery in 3 of the following 4 geographic colonial regions. First is the often ignored North, where slaves worked in agricultural and urban employments from the Delaware River to the Canadian Maritime Provinces, but where a true plantation system failed to develop. Second is land facing and encircling Chesapeake Bay and extending into Virginia's Piedmont. By the time of America's War of Independence, Virginia and Maryland contained over 1/2 of the nation's slaves and nearly 1/3 of the total colonial population. Thus, by 1775, 2 out of every 5 Virginians was a black slave. Though the original demand for slave labor focused on the production of tobacco, a decline in profits from tobacco led in the 18th century to the increasing use of slave labor, especially in inland farming, for the planting, care, and harvesting of corn and grains. As urban centers like Richmond and Baltimore grew in the post-revolutionary era, owners also made profitable use of slave labor in iron manufacture, shipbuilding, mining, and other industries. In the third distinct region, the Carolina and Georgia Low Country, plantations originally modeled on the Caribbean prospered by producing rice and, for a briefer period, indigo for the dyeing of textiles. By the late 18th century, many planters turned to high-grade Sea Island cotton along the coast. Then the perfection of the cotton gin and screw press gave a tremendous stimulus to the cultivation of short staple cotton, which revolutionized the British and American textile industries and eventually spread westward from inland Georgia and South Carolina to Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas, and Texas. The fourth region, Spanish Florida and French Louisiana, was of minor economic importance until those territories were annexed to the United States in the 19th century, and will thus be only mentioned here. Spanish Florida, which fell under British rule from 1763 to 1783, was especially notable for its raids against its northern neighbors and its role as a refuge for fugitive slaves from South Carolina and Georgia. French Louisiana, which was ruled by Spain from 1763 to 1800, moved toward the development of a plantation system, but this goal was impeded by a combination of slave insurrection and Native American attacks. To turn then to the history of colonies north of the Chesapeake, we should first observe that no British founders of North American colonies, except for South Carolina, intended to create slave societies. By the 1600s, Britain had been relatively free from slavery for 4 centuries, and in New England, despite the enslavement of hostile Indians, many of whom were shipped to the West Indies and even exchanged for black slaves, there was some resistance to the entry of slaves from Africa. In 1646, Puritan magistrates in Massachusetts were shocked to discover that some New Englanders had raided an African village and seized 2 Africans by treachery and violence, and had then brought them across the Atlantic for sale in Massachusetts. The General Court condemned this heinous and crying sin of man-stealing, and ordered the 2 blacks to be returned to their native land. 6 years later, Rhode Island passed a law condemning the practice of enslaving Negroes for life, and ordered that any slaves brought within the liberties of this colony be set free after a term of 10 years, as the manner is with the English servants. But the law was not enforced, and by the 1690s, New England laws were beginning to regulate the conduct of black slaves. Despite the rarity and novelty of moral repudiations of slavery before the mid-18th century, 2 early anti-slavery documents serve as examples of the misgivings felt by a few northern colonists before racial slavery became both widely accepted and deeply entrenched. In 1688, at a time when English and American Quakers were becoming increasingly involved as the owners and traders of slaves in the Atlantic slave system, 4 Dutch-speaking Quaker immigrants in Germantown, Pennsylvania, signed and sent a strongly worded anti-slavery petition to their local Quaker monthly meeting, which then referred it to higher governing groups, which quietly buried it. The Germantown Quakers condemned the purchase of African slaves as the equivalent of purchasing stolen goods, and asserted that the blacks had a perfect right to liberty since slaveholding was based on sheer physical force, and thus violated divine law. The authors stressed the hypocrisy of a model Quaker colony robbing and selling men against their will. As refugees from Europe's religious intolerance, these radical Quakers compared those who were oppressed for conscience' sake with these oppressed who are a black color. It was highly disturbing, they stressed, to think that countries in Europe would hear that Quakers in Pennsylvania do here handle men as they handle there the cattle. Unfortunately, this early document was unknown to such later Quaker abolitionists as John Woolman and Anthony Benezet, and was not rediscovered until the 19th century. A second revealing example is the pamphlet The Selling of Joseph, written by the prominent Massachusetts jurist Samuel Sewall, and published in 1700, a time when Boston was receiving a sudden influx of African slaves. Sewall had recently and publicly asked for forgiveness for his sins in helping in 1692 to condemn to death the so-called witches in Salem. In 1700, after he had upheld a young male slave's claim to freedom, Sewall was plunged into a long and bitter debate with the slave's former owner, a prosperous merchant and landowner who had served as a judge himself. While Sewall's tract displayed some doubts and uncertainty, and asserted that freed blacks could never embody with us and grow up into orderly families to the peopling of the land, but must still remain in our body politic as a kind of extravasate blood. He did attack the injustice of enslaving fellow humans who, like the Puritans, were also the descendants of Adam and Eve. This break with the traditional Christian acceptance of slavery as a necessary part of a sinful world would help to inspire such later radical opponents of slavery as the apocalyptic Quaker Benjamin Lay. Unlike the Puritan founders of New England, the Dutch, who began settling Manhattan and the larger New Netherland in the early 17th century, could not rely on the immigration of thousands of their native people. There were no Dutch Puritans eager to escape religious persecution and to found model societies. The influx of black slaves, and by 1630 there were free blacks as well as slaves in white settlements on both sides of the Hudson River, can be seen as part of an almost cosmic movement of Africans to virtually every New World colony, as European proprietors compared the promising wealth to be derived from almost infinite amounts of fertile land with the dire shortage of productive labor. But the fact that black slaves would constitute about 20% of the population of New Amsterdam by the end of Dutch rule in 1664 was also related to such fortuitous events as Holland's long war for independence from Spain, which led to the capture of many slaves on Spanish and Portuguese ships, and to Holland's temporary dominance of the Atlantic slave trade, following the Dutch capture of Elmina and other slave-trading centers on the West African coast. Governor Peter Stuyvesant and local Dutch merchants even sold many slaves to Virginia and Maryland. While New Amsterdam's small population included settlers from various European nations, the colony failed to attract many indentured servants to do the heaviest and least desirable kinds of work. It is thus revealing that the Dutch West India Company, which ran the colony, tried over a period of 30 years to attract prosperous farmers from Holland by promising to import and sell African slaves as a means of ensuring a cheap supply of labor. As it happened, the lives of white workers who did emigrate, and who were typically bound to work for a master for 7 years, were not significantly different from the lives of most slaves, whose status under the Dutch was more ambiguous than it would be under the English in the later 17th and the 18th centuries. Many of the slaves, having lived in the West Indies, the Spanish colonies, or the Atlantic islands, were multilingual, familiar with Christian cultures, and adept at acquiring privileges and negotiating for their freedom or half-freedom. When the English acquired New Amsterdam, renamed New York in 1664, 75 of the city's 375 blacks were free. Partly owing to Dutch uncertainties over the effects of baptism, and the Dutch ended religious conversions by 1655, blacks had come to see Christian conversion as a means of appealing for liberation. Hair and skin color had not yet become a symbol of inherent degradation, and a screen to obscure the realities of economic dependence and exploitation. The discovery in 1991 of the underground burial site of some 20,000 African Americans in Lower Manhattan underscored the central economic importance of black slavery in northern cities, as well as in many rural areas. It is highly misleading to look only at the small percentage of slaves in 18th century colony-wide populations, for example, 8% in New Jersey, or under 4% in Connecticut. In the mid-18th century, black slaves performed at least one-third of all physical labor in New York City. By 1750, slaves made up 34% of the population of Kings County, Brooklyn, and 18% of New York County. Rural slaves, who were indispensable in supplying the towns and cities with food, were concentrated in highly productive farms on Long Island, in northern New Jersey, and in the great manors and estates along the Hudson Valley. Even the more prosperous white tenant farmers owned slaves on the great manors of families like the Livingstons, the Van Rensselaers, and the Schuylers, somewhat analogous to the Lavradores de Cana in Brazil, though on a much smaller scale. Sojourner Truth, the famous 19th century black abolitionist and feminist, had been born a slave on such a manor in Ulster County, New York, a state in which slavery persisted until 1827. Connecticut, which outlawed slavery only in 1848, contained an estimated 5,698 blacks, most of them slaves, in 1770, compared to 25 in Vermont, 4,754 in Massachusetts, 10,460 in New Jersey, and 19,062 in New York. Connecticut even contained a large slave plantation-like farm in New London County. Neighboring Rhode Islanders, who dominated the 18th century northern slave trade with Africa, used many slaves in a horse breeding industry that also led to great estates modeled on those of West India planters. Amazingly, in 1770, there were more black slaves in the colony of New York than in Georgia. What mainly distinguished northern societies with slaves from southern, West Indian, and Brazilian slave societies was the lack of staple crops for export, such as tobacco, sugar, and rice, and thus the fact that their economies were not truly based on slave labor. Yet the whites in charge of much northern farming, stock raising, and rural industry, including tanneries, salt works, and iron furnaces, employed many slaves and also shipped their products to West Indian markets. In 18th century New York and East Jersey, slaves could be found working at virtually every kind of job, from building roads, clearing land, cutting timber for firewood, and herding cattle and pigs in the countryside, to such urban skilled occupations as carpentry, shoemaking, blacksmithing, stoneworking, butchering, milling, weaving, and even goldsmithing. Moreover, slaves and free blacks were especially evident as dock workers, boat pilots, and sailors. Slaves not only worked alongside white laborers, but were often leased out by their owners, or even allowed to hire out their labor and skills at considerable profit for their owners. Above all, ownership of black slaves as household servants became almost universal among the white elite, and even the prosperous middle class from Boston to Baltimore. In British Manhattan, some 40% of white households owned slaves. By the 1760s, black slaves constituted 3/4 of Philadelphia's servant population. Blacks of both sexes, living in back rooms, lofts, attics, or alley shacks, were engaged throughout the North in cooking their owners' meals, house cleaning, caring for children, tending gardens and stables, and running errands. There was thus far less racial segregation by residents in the mid-18th century than in the early 21st century. One should also stress that in the North, most labor was performed by whites, including apprentices and bound servants, and that very few whites were exempt from work. This meant that slaves often worked alongside white farmers. There were no planters, as in the Caribbean, lolling in hammocks while guzzling rum and giving orders to black stewards. Nor, as in Brazil, were there squads of slaves transporting privileged whites in sedan chairs. Some travelers were shocked when they discovered that American families were too familiar with their slaves. Madam Sarah Kemble Knight, for example, was filled with disgust at the sight of a Connecticut family that allowed their slaves to sit and eat with them at the family table, as they say, to save time, and into the same dish goes the black hoof as freely as the white hand. Yet evidence from the Manhattan African burial ground also suggests a level of strenuous overwork for black children as well as adults. The social heterogeneity of New York and East Jersey helps to explain many of the surprising aspects of racial slavery, from the time when the Dutch used slaves as the executioners of white criminals and as soldiers to fight off Indian attacks, to the early English period, when at least 30 free blacks had become independent landowners in Manhattan. A large cultural gap separated the many acculturated or semi-acculturated slaves who drank, gambled, and danced with lower-class whites at various taverns and alehouses, or who were persuaded to become serious members of the white Lutheran or Moravian churches, from the slaves who, after 1712, began arriving in increasing numbers directly from Africa. Yet the white decision to import more Africans and to reduce the number of slaves, especially Spanish-speaking slaves from the tumultuous West Indies, was in part a response to the threat of slave unity and violent resistance signified by the New York conspiracies of 1712 and 1741. Many whites considered Africans less dangerous than blacks from the Caribbean. Ironically, though 2 Spanish-speaking slaves were involved in the insurrection of 1712, most of the rebels who set fire to a building and then ambushed and killed 9 of the whites who rushed to extinguish the fire were Coromantine and Paw Africans. Whites used such labels, often connected with the original African point of departure. The much larger 1741 conspiracy not only included a group of Spanish blacks recently captured by a British ship in the Caribbean, but coincided with a major English war with Spain and France, and with news of a succession of slave insurrections in the West Indies. When the plot was suddenly uncovered, implicating Irish, French, Dutch, and even English conspirators, the whites could thus be seen and punished as traitors who were guilty of a criminal attempt to aid the Spanish and French Catholic cause by plotting with African and American-born slaves to burn down the city of New York. As the hysteria mounted, nearly 200 slaves were arrested and interrogated, and 13 blacks were burned at the stake, and 17 were hanged. The number of executions exceeded those at the Salem witchcraft debacle, and 70 blacks were deported to the Caribbean. Strangely enough, while convicted slaves were being hanged and burned at the stake, and hanging corpses were allowed to rot in the summer heat, the transatlantic wars, which included many Native Americans on different sides, created a drastic labor shortage in the middle colonies, and thus a greater demand for slave labor directly from Africa. The arrival of increasing numbers of Africans renewed among slaves a knowledge of West African traditions and cultures. This development helps to explain the use of the word African, as free blacks in the late 18th century began to name their first churches and fraternal societies. And both slaves and free blacks injected African elements into their celebration of such Christian rituals as Pinkster, originally the Dutch version of Pentecost, the time when Christ's apostles received the Holy Spirit, a holy day that some slaves had known in Africa as a result of the teachings of Catholic missionaries. On such occasions in New Amsterdam, blacks and whites had drunk wine together and had danced to African as well as Dutch music. There was also racial mixing and partying in the merry celebration of the later Negro Election Day, which included symbolic role reversals, typified by parades in which blacks dressed in their masters' clothing and rode their masters' horses, as well as the election of black kings and judges. Despite such events and the racial mingling at cockfights and fairs, white workers increasingly resented the competition from slave workers and the way that slavery degraded most forms of labor. Skilled workers were especially sensitive to this kind of stigma by the mid-1700s, a time when Northerners began a long quest to ennoble physical labor. As I will argue in Chapter 12, this growing desire helped prepare the way for anti-slavery movements. In urban centers like Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, this gradual reevaluation of white ambition, leading to the birth of what would later be termed the American Dream, helped to weaken the foundations of slavery. It also intensified the fumes of racism. We seem to find an opposite climate of opinion when we move to the Chesapeake in the mid-17th century. Many decades ago, historians were astonished to discover relative racial tolerance and flexibility, especially in Virginia's Northampton County, on the eastern shore of Chesapeake Bay. For example, among various examples of self-purchase, the owner of the slave Francis Payne agreed in 1643 to give him full control over the crops he grew in exchange for delivery at the end of the season of a stipulated amount of tobacco and corn. Then the owner signed a contract allowing Payne to buy his freedom by using his profits to purchase for his owner 3 white male servants. Over a period of 13 years, Payne succeeded not only in buying white indentured servants, but in paying for his own freedom, as well as that of his wife and children. Moreover, Payne's wife may even have been white. Other black slaves, such as Anthony Johnson, bought their own freedom, acquired sizable estates of land, conducted business with white planters and merchants, and even purchased their own slaves or white servants. No one knows how typical or atypical Northampton County may have been, since we lack such detailed records for other parts of Virginia and Maryland. Nevertheless, there is evidence to support the conclusion of the historian Ira Berlin. Throughout the 17th and into the first decades of the 18th century, black and white servants ran away together, slept together, and upon occasion stood shoulder to shoulder against established authority. Since class divisions were then more meaningful than race, it appears that in the mid-1600s, 1/4 to 1/3 of the illegitimate children born to white females, mostly indentured servants, were mulattoes. In both Virginia and Maryland, the legislatures became increasingly alarmed by this sexual intermixture, and passed laws against racial intermarriage, as well as punishments for white women who gave birth to mulatto children. That abominable mixture and spurious issue, as the Virginia Assembly put it. Nothing was said about black women who gave birth to the mulatto children of white fathers. Even though laws beginning in the 1660s imposed increasing restrictions on black slaves and by 1691 prohibited Virginian masters from manumitting their slaves unless they paid for the expulsion of such freed people from the colony, it is clear that in the earlier period, blacks had become acculturated and even integrated to a degree in the Chesapeake societies. To understand this anomaly and the later shift to a sharp and almost unbridgeable separation between black slaves and poor whites, one must look at Anglo-American demography and the changing sources of the Chesapeake region's labor supply from the founding of Jamestown in 1607. During the 1500s and early 1600s, England's population grew far more rapidly than the economy did. Given the resulting shortage of jobs, the roads became crowded with so-called vagabonds in search of work, food, or things to steal. The government's enclosure policy greatly exacerbated this problem by seizing public lands and evicting whole villages of people. One of the motives for New World colonization was the desire of authorities to rid England of the so-called dangerous classes, while also discovering precious metals and producing the kinds of commodities England had been forced to import from foreign countries. Despite the arrival of a handful of black slaves, English indentured servants more than met the demand for labor stimulated by Virginia's great tobacco boom of 1620s. With contracts covering from 5 to 7 years, or longer for minors, such white servants could be sold and resold. Their conditions of life were closer to those of a slave than to a servant in England. Some indentured servants did later manage to acquire farms and even servants of their own, but given their appalling mortality from disease in the early decades, such servants had only a 50-50 chance of surviving a 5-year term and collecting their freedom dues, a small cash payment or a piece of land. Until the last third of the 17th century, there were enough English teenagers, farm laborers, and artisans who were deluded by the colonizers' propaganda to meet the Chesapeake colony's expanding demand for labor. The flow of such voluntary immigrants was supplemented by the deportation of petty criminals, including debtors, as well as Irish prisoners and rebellious Scots. This picture began to change dramatically when the English birth rate fell, especially during the Civil War of the 1640s, when wages rose in England, and when the city of London needed rebuilding after the disastrous fire of 1666. Moreover, many English migrants, or potential migrants, found such new colonies as Pennsylvania, New York, and South Carolina more promising. Thus, beginning in the mid-1670s, large landowners in Virginia and Maryland, many of whom said they would prefer white indentured servants, turned to the purchase of slaves directly from Africa. In the late 1670s, white servants still outnumbered black slaves 4-1, but by the early 1690s, slaves outnumbered white servants nearly 4-1. The slave ships would drop anchor near the houses of great planters along shores of the York, Rappahannock, or Potomac rivers. Wealthy planters like Robert King Carter, who owned the local iron foundry, flour mill, and blacksmith shop, would then board a ship, examine slaves, and agree for a 10% commission to sell the captive Africans to his neighbors. In time, most of the Africans, who were disproportionately male, would be sent to more distant inland quarters, where they could more easily be supervised and controlled as they performed heavy labor in clearing forests and new land before the planting of tobacco. Planters tended to view Africans as strange and bestial savages, who needed to be confined in sex-segregated barracks and stripped of any family or ethnic identity. But while planters and overseers subjected such slaves to much whipping and other violence, and required them to work in regimented gangs, following the pace of the fastest laborer, it also became essential for the slaves to acquire certain skills. It should be stressed that the cultivation of tobacco required careful, painstaking effort, which included care in worming and topping each plant, in cutting the stalks, and then in curing the leaves in tobacco houses. Slaves also devoted much time to raising livestock and growing edible crops. A small number of native-born blacks or Creoles had much greater opportunities of entering various artisan trades. Some became carpenters, wheelwrights, tanners, tailors, blacksmiths, masons, architects, silversmiths, and furniture makers. A few others appeared as household servants or even managers of estates, familiar with their master's language and mores, which they could often turn to their own advantage. This creation of a slave hierarchy helped to counteract any sense of effective black unity. While it is true that conspiracies were often led by privileged slaves, they were also usually revealed by privileged slaves. In colonial Virginia, masters were especially inclined to encourage slave skills and also, when labor demands diminished, to hire out some slaves for wages that would increase the owner's profits. A few slaves, particularly Africans, escaped at least temporarily to Virginia's swamps, but such marriage was not nearly as successful as the maroon settlements in the Caribbean, Brazil, and even Florida. Partly for demographic and geographic reasons, whites in the Chesapeake could exercise much stricter racial control than whites in the West Indies or South Carolina. Of course, many slaves became fugitives, as in all slave-owning regions, but the posted advertisements often suggested a paternalistic desire on the part of owners to negotiate with such slaves, who may often have absconded precisely for such bargaining. Some masters advertised, in effect, "Jack, if you return home, you'll be free to choose a new owner." Or an owner would promise forgiveness, or, in order to avoid a capital loss, would promise to return you to your former beloved owner. Masters also expressed outrage over the insolence or the saucy and impudent tongue of a given runaway. Ads often repeated the charge that a slave had been ungrateful, or had run away without any cause. We also find the complaint that he has great notions of freedom. It is clear that African-born slaves were more quickly spotted and apprehended, but the ads show a special concern over light-skinned slaves who might pass as whites, and over literate blacks who forged passes and were quick-talking or fluent and skilled. Fugitives often headed for towns where they might blend into a community of free blacks, but when habitual runaways were apprehended, they faced severe punishment and often sailed to an unsuspecting buyer. Robert King Carter bragged about curing a fugitive slave by cutting off his toes. In the colonial Chesapeake, such brutal punishments, and there were worse dismemberments, coexisted with a kind of white paternalism that was rare in regions farther south. Masters supervised and intervened in most areas of black life, giving their slaves orders, advice, instruction, and all kinds of attention. This involvement was partly the result of demography. Even in Tidewater, Virginia, in the 1730s, only about 30% of adult slaves lived on plantations with 10 or more slaves, and another 30% lived on units with only 1 or 2 slaves. This low density could sometimes lead to very close ties between slaves and white families, as can be seen in the 19th century in letters sent back to Virginia from slaves who had been freed and sent to Liberia. Philip D. Morgan has even found a case in the late 1780s in which a fugitive slave named Peter was in cahoots with his former master to defraud would-be owners of slaves. In Virginia, in contrast to slave societies farther south, and to most examples of slavery in human history, the slave population began by the 1720s to increase rapidly by natural means. While the reasons for this natural expansion are complex, and the positive growth rate would soon distinguish North American slavery in general, most Virginia planters were eager to encourage this result, which brought them significant capital gains on their investments. They promoted slave marriages and often showed sympathy to the slaves' appeals to allow husbands and wives to reside on the same plantation. For a time, there may have been a conscious effort to import more female slaves in order to achieve a balanced sex ratio. By the 1760s, this rapid growth enabled Virginia's leaders to take a seemingly high moral ground against the Atlantic slave trade. Their efforts to restrict or even halt further importations from Africa were disallowed by the Crown. One must also add that many Virginia planters and political leaders were becoming, by the 1760s, increasingly terrified by the rapid growth of the slave population, at a time when no one could foresee the vast future markets for slaves in Kentucky and the Southwest. Like some white Cubans in the 19th century, many Virginians expressed alarm over the growing density of blacks in eastern counties and over the danger, as the famous Virginian William Byrd had earlier put it, that their colony would sometime or other be confirmed by the name of New Guinea. This understanding that Virginia should be thought of and preserved as a colony for whites helps to explain a fundamental difference from South Carolina, or especially such Caribbean societies as the French colony of Saint-Domingue, where whites allied themselves with a large free-colored class, which enjoyed privileges denied to blacks. In the Chesapeake, all people of African ancestry were increasingly seen and defined as Negro. This arbitrary racial classification gradually became the norm for most of the United States. And this basic dualism or division between whites and Negroes, between the free and the slave, leads to the argument of the historian Edmund S. Morgan that Virginia's slavery and racism became, paradoxically, the social and ideological basis for America's dedication to freedom and equality. One should remember that Virginia, which in the 1770s had a larger population than New York and Pennsylvania combined, produced the leaders who wrote the Declaration of Independence and the first state constitution, who led in winning the war against Britain, and who did the most in drafting the Constitution and setting in motion the new federal government. Morgan's thesis, In American Slavery, American Freedom, is best summarized by his own words, and is important enough to deserve a long and vivid quotation. Racism thus absorbed in Virginia the fear and contempt that men in England, whether Whig or Tory, monarchist or Republican, felt for the inarticulate lower classes. Racism made it possible for white Virginians to develop a devotion to the equality that English Republicans had declared to be the soul of liberty. There were too few free poor on hand to matter, and by lumping Indians, mulattoes, and Negroes in a single pariah class, Virginians had paved the way for a similar lumping of small and large planters in a single master class. Virginians knew that the members of this class were not in fact equal, either in property or in virtue, just as they knew that Negroes, mulattoes, and Indians were not one and the same. But the forces which dictated that Virginians see Negroes, mulattoes, and Indians as one also dictated that they see large and small planters as one. Racism became an essential, if unacknowledged, ingredient of the Republican ideology that enabled Virginians to lead the nation. Thus, it was the collective degradation of outsider people that enabled Virginians to free white Americans from the traditional constraints of class conflict and pursue the dream of a new era of liberty and equality. The far more conservative culture of the Deep South centered in South Carolina, which by 1690 had been partly settled by whites and black slaves from Barbados, and in that year instituted a slave code adapted from Barbados. Though North Carolina imported some slaves directly from Africa in the 1680s, the colony had a much slower development than South Carolina as a result of its treacherous coastline and lack of harbors. Even by 1730, North Carolina contained no more than 6,000 settlers. Georgia, only founded in the 1730s, was originally intended to be an asylum for poor whites, orphans, and debtors. Some pragmatic English philanthropists and statesmen envisioned a colony that would enable members of the unproductive classes to supply England with silk, wine, and other products for which England had long depended on Catholic Europe. No less important, Georgia would be a buffer state between South Carolina and Spanish Florida. Since there was a fear that the presence of slaves would deter the immigration of white workers, and also present the Spanish in Florida with an opportunity to incite insurrections, a special law of 1735 for rendering the colony of George more defensible prohibited slavery. James Oglethorpe, the main founder and original governor of Georgia, owned slaves on a Carolina plantation and was also a high officer of the slave-trading Royal African Company. Nevertheless, he and some of the first settlers struggled to maintain Georgia as the only free soil region in the Western Hemisphere. By 1749, however, so many slaves had been smuggled into the colony, and so many settlers had come to see the necessity of slave labor, that the trustees decided to ask for a repeal of the anti-slavery law. Despite some futile attempts at imperial regulation, Georgia finally emerged as a slave society in which, like South Carolina, blacks outnumbered whites along the coast and in the islands just off the coast. Any foreign visitor to the colony of South Carolina would have been amazed by the differences between the low country plantation districts producing rice and indigo and urban Charlestown, later Charleston, which happened to be the port of entry for 40% of all African slaves imported into North America before 1808. Few whites could have understood the Gullah language, which for hundreds of years enabled the coastal plantation slaves to communicate with one another. This Creole mixture of Elizabethan English and such African languages as Fonte, Igbo, Yoruba, Ewe, and Mandinka developed through trial and error, and was part of a rich evolving culture of music, art, food, and storytellers. Individual Gullah words, ba, brother, sabe, save, bress, bless, atta, after, might have been easier for a visitor to understand than the spoken flow of cadence and accents. Such Creole languages with distinctive grammatical forms were common in the Caribbean and Brazil. In Charlestown, on the other hand, slaves tended to be highly acculturated and skilled at interacting with colonial whites and their institutions. Slave women, for example, dominated Charlestown's central market, selling beef, pork, fish, and vegetables. No other townspeople handled so much cash, a large percentage of which went to their owners. Some slaves lived on their own, apart from their masters, and hired out their own or even opened shops, paying a portion of their earnings for this de facto freedom. In Charlestown, one could also find slaves who had become tailors, carpenters, cabinet makers, shipwrights, and barrel makers, often earning and keeping or hiding impressive profits. Others worked as butchers, fishermen, and porters. Tenuous privileges and initiatives were not limited to towns and to American-born slaves. Some white planters seem to have known that they could greatly benefit from the skills of African-born slaves who were familiar with the flora and fauna of semi-tropical coastal regions, and above all with the techniques of rice cultivation. As the historian Peter H. Wood has observed, literally hundreds of black immigrants were more familiar with the planting, hoeing, processing, and cooking of rice than were the European settlers who purchased them. During the pioneering period of settlement, a few former Africans even acquired managerial positions as they showed whites how to develop a lowland cattle industry and helped plan as well as construct dikes to control the irrigation of low-lying rice fields. It should be added that despite some unenforced laws, many rural slaves supplemented their diet by regular hunting, fishing, and gardening. Despite constant complaints from whites about the independence of black slaves for the first half-century of South Carolina's history, black soldiers proved to be indispensable in repelling attacks from the west by Indians and from the south by the Spanish. When white colonists recognized that their province is in danger of being lost and our lives are threatened, they saw the necessity of giving slaves lances and guns, as well as drums to beat, in order to communicate and arouse a will to fight. One planter, who noted that the militia included a considerable number of active, able Negro slaves, added that any slave who in the time of an invasion kills an enemy would be freed, and his master recompensed. While only a few slaves seem to have been liberated, hundreds fought the powerful Indian attacks in the Tuscarora War of 1711-12 and the Yamasee War of 1715. If some blacks deserted and joined the enemy, others were captured and tortured along with the white prisoners. Too little attention has been given to the long and extremely complex relationship between blacks and Indians, especially in the South. Indians long helped whites track down fugitive slaves hidden in forests and swamps, and also helped suppress slave uprisings. Some Indians profited from stealing and selling slaves, actions encouraged by the British in the American Revolution. In 1783, for example, Alexander McGillivray, a mixed-blood Indian chief, sent stolen slaves to Pensacola, Florida, for shipment to Jamaica. Whites kept reminding slaves of such hazards, and used blacks as troops when raiding Indian camps. In general, the major southern tribes accepted racial slavery, acquired and traded many black slaves, adopted laws based on those of the southern states, and even transported slaves westward when the Indians were forced to move to what became Oklahoma. Yet despite the Indians' racist laws, there was much intermixture, and large numbers of African Americans eventually became proud of their Indian ancestry. To return to the remarkable disorder and fluidity of South Carolina's early pioneering period, before the truly massive importation of Africans began, one can often learn much from protests and grievances, as in the following complaint of some white petitioners in 1706. For at this last election, Jews, strangers, sailors, servants, Negroes, and almost every Frenchman in Craven and Berkeley County came down to elect, and their votes were taken. In other words, a region that would ultimately become the most ardently pro-slavery and racist center in America seems at one time to have allowed blacks, perhaps even slaves, to vote, along with a motley assortment of settlers. If some slaves willingly joined backwoods expeditions against the Cherokees, others appeared in frontier gangs of banditti or escaped to Spanish Florida, where many found refuge among the Seminoles. It was not until the 1760s that a regulator movement emerged to combat frontier crime and employ force to capture a labor force for farmers in the upcountry who aspired to become planters. Much earlier, blacks in the Lowcountry had suffered a dramatic change of status after a few white planters made spectacular fortunes from growing and exporting rice and indigo. As the 18th century progressed, rich planters congregated in Charlestown or traveled to the north during the malaria season, entrusting their estates to stewards, overseers, and black drivers. This success led South Carolina planters to invest in massive purchases of slaves from Africa, mostly males, in order to maximize production. Increasing slave mortality, the result of a higher percentage of Africans, coupled with the imbalanced sex ratio, helped to explain why South Carolina's black population, unlike that in the Chesapeake, did not achieve a positive growth rate until shortly before the American Revolution. In one respect, South Carolina's slaveholders were more integrated with their blacks than were their Virginian counterparts. They were far more inclined to acknowledge their sexual relations with the black women and sometimes freed their own mulatto offspring. Thus, a somewhat privileged caste emerged, as in the Caribbean, though on a much smaller scale, made up of light-skinned people of color. Eventually, local courts even bestowed the status of white on some families who were visibly colored but known to be of good character. Since there were also people of color who unofficially passed into the racially elite white category, an unknown number of later white South Carolinians actually had some African ancestry. While the great majority of South Carolina's slaves were subjected to a harsh regimen of labor, they had far more social and cultural autonomy in the colonial period than slaves in the Chesapeake. According to Philip D. Morgan, this flexibility and relative lack of restraint probably gave the owners of urban slaves greater rather than less physical security. The ability of slaves to visit a relative or go underground probably siphoned off as much potential disorder as it created. Slavery in Charleston, where the majority of slaves were women, was more, not less secure than it was in the surrounding countryside. On the low country plantations, in striking contrast to other parts of the South, the task system became the norm. Each day an overseer or some other authority would call for a precise work objective: so many rows of rice to sow, so much grain to thresh. In practice, this system gave most slaves the incentive to work hard and complete the task by early afternoon, allowing them to leave the fields, return home, and tend their own gardens and livestock. Surprisingly, it was common for masters and other whites to buy from slaves such produce as melons, corn, peas, potatoes, fish, poultry, and even the slaves' own grown rice and small livestock. This measure of control over their own lives also enabled lowland slaves, at least those who remained in coastal South Carolina, to accumulate a good bit of personal property. Despite the absence of legal title, some slave families passed on to their descendants household goods, linens, glassware, china, cows, pigs, ducks, guns, saddles, horses, and at least in one case, a personal slave named Tom. Such liberal-sounding customs were more than counterbalanced by the workings of positive law regarding human property and debt. As increasing numbers of slaveholders in the South took out mortgages on their slave property or faced bankruptcy, it became more and more common to see the spectacle of slaves being auctioned on courthouse steps. The multiplication of creditors with claims against the bankrupt and the deceased, to say nothing of the rising demand for slaves as settlement spread westward, meant that slave families were constantly broken and divided by greed as well as the workings of the law. In the long era before the American Revolution, the greatest trial of the slave regime in the Deep South came in 1739, a time when blacks in South Carolina outnumbered whites almost 2-to-1, and when news of war between England and Spain meant that the Spanish in Florida would offer liberty to Carolinian slaves who could escape to the South. In what would be known as the Stono Rebellion, about 20 slaves broke into a store by the Stono River, seized arms, and killed 2 white storekeepers whose heads were left on the store's front steps. At this point, a slave named Jemmy led the band southward to the beat of drums. While burning plantations, killing whites, and enlarging the rebel group to at least 60, the rebels came close to capturing South Carolina's lieutenant governor. But accounts of this uprising often fail to mention that over 30 slaves were later rewarded for protecting their masters and fighting and killing some of the insurgents. The latter apparently included Africans, whereas the loyal slaves were more likely to be assimilated Creoles. Eventually, mounted and well-armed planters headed off and defeated the rebels. Scores of blacks were then executed. In 1740, partly as a result of the Stono Uprising, South Carolina adopted a new, harsher slave code and cut back temporarily on importing slaves from Africa. In the Deep South, we must conclude, slavery was successful. As an economic system, it worked. Yet with or without rebellions, the system always involved brutal treatment and exploitation, as well as a continual testing of limits.
Please consider supporting us by clicking on the like and subscribe buttons. Your support will be greatly appreciated.